Hello. The title of this lecture is Christianity and Socialism. And I'm going to be focusing on the National Socialist Party of Germany, better known as Nazi Germany. And the first half of the lecture is providing the historical context of Nazi Germany. And then the second half will be looking at the response of Christians to what was unfolding in Nazi Germany. Revolutionary socialism and democratic socialism are not the only forms of socialism. Adolf Hitler was a socialist of a different sort. Nazi economic doctrine was based on centralized decision making. The Nazis wrested economic decision making power from the private sector and placed it squarely in the hands of the federal bureaucracy. The Nazis controlled where people worked. One way to contrast the revolutionary socialism of communist Russia and the National Socialism of Germany is that in Russia, all owners were shot. In Germany, all owners who disobeyed were shot. As for Christianity, the National Socialists allowed German churches to continue their work providing the clergy obeyed Nazi doctrine. Historian Paul Johnson writes that the communists and the communist and fascist forms of totalitarianism were originally linked in the process of historical development. The very existence of the Leninist state with its one-party control of all aspects of public life and its systematized moral relativism offered a model to all those who hated free market capitalism and parliamentary democracy. Hitler's National Socialists saw the benefits of Russian thinking that did away with democratic notions of liberty. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Weimar Republic never gained the confidence of Germans. Some blamed it for the fall of Germany, both militarily and diplomatically. The severe inflation of the early 1920s played a major role in the weakening of the republic. Hyperinflation wreaked havoc on the economy and wiped out the savings of many Germans. This period saw the rise of the National Socialists who took advantage of the split between the Social Democrats and Revolutionary Socialists, better known as the Communists. There was, there was not much support for politicians favoring democracy and free market capitalism. Like Lenin, Hitler never seriously attempted to make his living by any other means than politics. Also, like Lenin, Hitler despised parliamentary democracy or any type of liberalism. After the war, he took over a small proletarian group called the German Workers' Party. He added the words National Socialist to his title. Quote, though Hitler sometimes used the words nationalism and socialism as though they were interchangeable, the radical and socialist element in his program always remained strong. Again, As I said earlier, he loathed free market capitalism, which was a threat to his power. The National Socialist German Workers' Party represented a vanguard elite party on a mass base. Again, the similarities to Lenin are unmistakable. Like Lenin, Hitler believed, quote, that a highly disciplined and centralized party culminating in an autocratic apex was the only instrument capable of carrying through a fundamental revolution. Once in power, he put in motion a systematic party takeover of all the organs of society, exactly as Lenin did. Hitler took advantage of political divisiveness. Some historians place most of the blame on the Social Democrats. Quote, they might have created an unassailable left center bloc by dropping their nationalization and taxation schemes, but they refused to do so, fearing to lose ground on the left to the communists. In 1930, the Nazi Party became the second largest party in the Reichstag. As Germany experienced economic depression in the early 1930s, the Nazis promised efficient authoritarianism. Hitler did not hide the dictatorial and autocratic nature of his proposed regime. He took office as Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. Hermann Goebbels declared, quote, if we have the power, we'll never give it up again unless we're carried out of our offices as corpse. Within a month, Goebbels created an auxiliary police force of 50,000 to break up non-Nazi organizations capable of resisting Hitler. Quote, my measures will not be qualified by legal scruples or by bureaucracy. It is not my business to do justice. It is my business to annihilate and exterminate. That's all. In March 1933, a compliant Reichstag voted an enabling act which suspended the Constitution, established Hitler's dictatorship, and put an end to Germany's attempt at democratic Republican government. Hitler promised to take back industry from the capitalists, but he learned from Lenin's mistake. Quote, Hitler thought that Lenin's greatest economic mistake had been to order party members to take over the running of industry and kill or expel its capitalist managers. Hitler learned from this mistake. Hitler did not care about factory ownership so long as those managing a factory followed state orders. Following the Russian model, Hitler set up the apparatus of terror. Although many Germans supported Hitler's government, others were afraid. People realized that anyone disliked by the National Socialists might disappear without a trace, never to be seen again. Controlling the media, the Nazi hid much of their evil. But in time, the horror of the regime was exposed. For example, there's a tragic story of Jewish poet Heinrich Musham. He had been viewed by the Nazis as an enemy. Musham tried to lead Germany in 1933, but he was captured. He had bought a ticket for Prague, but he gave it to another person, quote, who was even more frightened than he was. At a camp, the Nazis smashed his glasses, knocked out his teeth, pulled chunks of hair from his head, broke his thumbs to prevent him from writing, and destroyed his hearing by bashing his ears. The Nazis thought of a way to force Musam to commit suicide. They took possession of a chimpanzee from the home of a scientist. Thinking it was a fierce animal, they threw it on the poet. But the monkey simply flung its arms around the poet's neck and hugged him. The Nazis were furious, so they tortured the frightened monkey to death in front of the poet, hoping Musam would commit suicide. He did not comply. Later, they beat him to death and hung him on a beam in a latrine. The story of his wife was also tragic. Before his arrest, he told his wife not to go to Moscow. Sadly, she traveled to Russia with his papers and was arrested. She spent the next 20 years in Soviet camps as a Trotskyite agent. The remaining 1930s saw greater evils against German Jews by the Nazis. But it did not stop at German borders. In early 1939, there were 8 million Jews in Europe. By the end of 1945, that is the end of the war, 6 million had been murdered. When Germany fell to the Nazi onslaught, Polish Jews paid a terrible price. 250,000 had escaped to the Soviet Union, but the rest were forced to live in restricted areas in the larger cities. The SS had cleared them out of the countryside, out of the rural areas. And so these Polish Jews were crammed into the cities, the worst one being in Warsaw. These ghettos experienced intense overcrowding, hunger, and disease. Those considered genuine German people were entitled to 2,300 calories as far as food and nutrition. But as a contrast, the Jews' limit was less than 200. The ghetto in Warsaw had a wall separating the Jews from the rest of the city. The Germans made the Jews build and pay for the wall. Young Jewish boys and girls were among those who smuggled food. But if they were caught, the penalty was death. When the German army conquered Belgium, Holland, France, Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David. Many eventually ended up in concentration camps. The same thing happened to Eastern European Jews. Murder was common. For example, in Serbia, 15,000 Jews deported from Serbia died in gas vans. The carbon monoxide from the van's exhaust was channeled into the sealed cabin in which between 80 and 150 victims stood crammed together. During the death process, the van was driven from the loading site to prepared graves. The German attack on the Soviet Union resulted in the execution of hundreds of thousands of Jews, mostly by the German SS units. In late September, the Germans murdered more than 30,000 Jews over a three-day period at a ravine outside of Kiev. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians all participated sadly in these murders. The final solution saw the increasing deportation of European Jews to camps set up solely for the purpose of mass murder. In December 1941, the first of these camps in German-occupied Poland was Chelmno. There, Jews died from exhaust fumes funneled back into the van. The commandant boasted killing 1,000 Jews per day by this method. In January 1942, a meeting of high-ranking German officials at Wannsee gave official sanction of the final solution. There were only two survivors of the 600,000 Jews deported to Belzec. The first gassings at Auschwitz took place in May 1942. The SS continued their deportations, and October 1942 saw the greatest numbers of Jews deported and murdered in any month of the year, 300,000 in all, 5% of the total Holocaust death toll. By early 1943, approximately 80% of Polish and Western Russian Jews had been murdered. The German search for Jewish victims continued even when the war was beginning to go against them. In March of 1944, the German army entered Hungary to prevent the Hungarian government from withdrawing from the war. Almost all the 430,000 deported Jews from Hungary died. Of the total 6 million who died over these years, 1.5 million were children. The Nazi regime was pure evil. But what was the response of the German churches? How did the German clergy respond to the Nazi reign of terror that unfolded from 1933 to 1945? Hitler wrote, quote, "The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity. Bolshevism is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew." Born and reared a Catholic, Hitler rejected Christian principles and replaced them with twisted ideas of National Socialism and anti Semitism. An astute politician, he took a pragmatic approach and wooed the support of clergy who feared communism. Hitler believed that the outdated Christian faith was near its last gasp. Some German clergy were confident that in time, Nazism would moderate its rough edges. They welcomed Hitler's recognition of the importance of motherhood and his opposition to prostitution and pornography. Catholic bishops did not oppose Hitler when he became chancellor in early 1933. Hitler and the Vatican actually had negotiated a deal that granted Catholics freedom to worship and that kept their church independent in Germany. Catholic churches could continue their educational system, they could continue to receive public funding. In return, Catholic clergy were to cease any political activities. If Catholics honored the agreement, they would continue to enjoy state protections, supposedly. Well, this meant turning a blind eye to Nazi violations to the agreement. And there were violations where the Nazis did not uphold the agreement made between the Vatican and the National Socialist Party. In essence, Hitler adopted a twofold approach to German churches, promising them autonomy under his regime while dismantling or assimilating aspects of their churches. Lacking vigorous biblical theology, liberal Protestantism was no match for Nazism. Many liberal Protestants upheld the perfectibility of the human race, which was actually consistent with Hitler's ideas. Some Protestants supported the nationalization of the provincial churches, including along Nazi lines. In its platform, the German Christian movement, led by Ludwig Müller, talked about, quote, positive Christianity. The German Christian movement did not talk about sin and salvation. The document of the German Christian movement, part of it went as follows, quote, we know something of Christian duty and love towards the helpless, but we demand also the protection of the nation from the incapable and inferior, end of quote. Thus, there were Protestants who believed that National Socialism represented the true fulfillment of Christianity. However, Hitler rejected the idea of a National Socialist state church. Even a Nazified church could backfire and split the loyalty of the German people for Hitler. In 1934, the Barmen Declaration was a theological document that focused on the central truth of Christianity. Consequently, it confronted the errors of totalitarian ideas. Much of the language was from the Protestant theologian Karl Barth. Those behind this document formed the Confessing Church. Its focus was to defend Christianity from any of the revisions desired by those who embraced Nazi extremes. The Confessing Church made no effort to challenge Hitler. In fact, it was supportive of Hitler's political and foreign policy decisions. Coming to terms with National Socialism was not an easy task. One historian writes, quote, harassed by the Gestapo and repudiated by most Protestant leaders, the Confessing Church led a perilous existence. Its very presence was an embarrassment to the Nazis, and its witness to Christ's lordship over the world implicitly challenged Hitler's totalitarianism. End of quote. And here in this photo, we have a group of the Confessing Church. Other critical clergy found themselves drafted in the army and sent to the battlefield. By 1939, the Confessing Church was dissolved. Members continued their opposition in exile or underground without success. German Catholics had valued their privileged status, but by the Nazi heavy-handedness with Catholic schools and journalism, people began to change their mind. In March 1937, the Pope delivered a church document that was critical of Nazism. The main point was that Nazism was a form of paganism. With considerable planning, Catholics smuggled it into Germany, where it was read in pulpits throughout the nation. Although he was furious, Hitler gave no public reaction. Instead, the pressure on Catholic leaders was more severe. Nonetheless, many Catholic and Protestant leaders saw that it was their duty as as members to support the German war effort. German church officials believed that a conciliatory position towards the state would lessen the suffering of Christians. They were wrong. Nazi leaders planned a settlement in church state relations that would weaken the church enough to ensure that Christianity would suffer, quote, a natural death. The National Socialists sought to maintain the popular support of the citizenry, and thus they did not carry out a publicized destruction of the churches. The situation in the German occupied areas was worse. The clergy were treated with disgust, with many of them murdered or sent to concentration camps. Near the end of the war, the Nazis executed German Christian leaders, notably the pacifist Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who interestingly was part of a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. Historian Justo Gonzalez writes how Bonhoeffer, quote, spoke of a world of coming of age and of God's presence in his world being much like that of a wise parent who recedes into the background as a child grows, end of quote. This sort of gives you a flavor of German Protestantism. A major historical debate is the role that the Pope played during World War II. Becoming Pope in March 1939, Pius XII was critical of Nazism, but he failed to specifically mention the persecution of the Jews. Historian Gonzalez writes that Pius, quote, was a man experienced in diplomatic affairs. He was also a mystic who spent hours in prayer and an incredibly intense worker whose aides often complained that he drove them too hard, and a man of personal magnetism who was much respected by friend and foe alike. By late 1941, high-ranking Vatican officials discovered the true purpose of deporting Jews was mass murder. For example, Giuseppe Berzio, the Vatican's representative in Slovakia, received proof that tens of thousands of Slovakian Jews were sent to their death at Polish internment camps. An Italian army chaplain visited the Vatican to share his evidence of numerous massacres of Jews in Ukraine. He was able to have a long meeting with Pius XII, followed by another meeting with the Pope in 1942. In March 1942, the Vatican received additional confirmation of the mass execution of Jews in Poland and Romania. By late summer 1942, the secretary to the Jewish World Congress, located in Geneva, sent a message to the American embassy in Switzerland about the extermination of over 3.5 million Jews, and even as high as 4 million. Pope Pius did little with this information. Defenders of the Pope point to a stance of strict neutrality that would allow him to negotiate reconciliation. There is also the argument that the National Socialists were too twisted with anti-Semitism hatred that no action by the Pope would have any effect. Moreover, any Catholic call to action would have been viewed as treason and thus would have put the lives of German Catholics in danger. This continues to be a lively debate. A final point is the analysis of Protestant fundamentalists. Many of them argued that 19th century German higher criticism and Darwinism had opened the door for the weakening of biblical Christianity in Germany. Many of these fundamentalists were located in America. Liberal Protestantism was helpless to slow evil Nazi ideas. Others have explored the impact of Darwinism in Germany. In his book, From Darwin to Hitler, historian Richard Weikart writes, quote, Darwinism by itself did not produce the Holocaust, but without Darwinism, especially in its social Darwinist and eugenics permutations, neither Hitler nor his Nazi followers would have had the necessary scientific underpinnings to convince themselves and their collaborators that one of the world's greatest atrocities was really morally praiseworthy. End of quote. Well, certainly the evil of the Nazis demands continued attention if lessons are to be learned on how best can Christianity respond to the state that demands obedience and recognition of biblical principles. Thank you.